Fred, under the present system, I give that value to the homeowner, and then what happens next? The government comes knocking on my door and says, awfully sorry, but we're going to have to tax your wages now. Why should we behave ethically if the people in power are not behaving ethically? It's like the highwaymen of the old days who stopped the coach and just simply said, stand and deliver. The planning system was never going to solve our problems. Further separate those who are the ones that are accumulating the capital gains and those who are excluded from them.
Hello and welcome to Meeting People with me, Amal Pandya. Meeting People is a podcast where I have long conversations with rebellious, adventurous and sometimes courteous free spirits. Fred, welcome back to the Meeting People podcast. You are my first returning guest, which is an exciting moment for me. So thanks again for coming along. The reason I wanted you on is you were kind enough to share with me your latest book, which I'm going to hold up to the camera, called Cheating, The Human Project and Its Betrayal. And in the book, you make some pretty punchy claims, one can say. One example I've got open here is the withdrawal of rent from its social functions is the root cause of the persistent collapse of civilizations. And that is a big claim which I'd love to explore and unpack over the course of the conversation. If people haven't seen our first episode that we did together, in your leisure, go back and watch it, but I don't think you need to. I think we can sort of cover some familiar ground, because I've found with your worldview, it's helpful to kind of have some repeat exposure rather than, it's not one and done. It kind of doesn't stick in the mind easily in many ways compared to what you're programmed to believe or think from one's education. So first off, can you start by explaining what is rent? Because everyone knows instinctively, or it's in the narrative, that rent seeking is bad. Rent seeking behavior is something that we need to stamp out, and it's the cause of a lot of our problems, but no one can really identify what they mean by rent seeking. What is it that they are seeking? What is rent in the first place?
Well, there are two ways of viewing rent. One is in its social status, context, and the other is in the context that we now use it. Today, we define rent as a transfer income. You guys produce the rent and you transfer it to me. I give you nothing back in return. It's a pure transfer. It's like the highwaymen of the old days who stopped the coach and just simply said, stand and deliver. Give me all that you treasure or I'll shoot you. And that's the relationship that people who collect rent have with the working population. You're not allowed access to the vital services and the land that you need unless you yield the rent. So the rent, to understand it effectively, as I explain in the book, we need to go back actually to our origins as a species. Originally, we were part of the primate family and we acted according to the laws of nature, which meant that we worked for the food we needed that day, we filled our stomachs, and then we basked in the sun. That was the end of the labour required to stay alive and to flourish within nature. But one branch of the primate species felt, well, that's not enough. We don't want to just live like that. The food that all species in nature labours for during the course of a day to fill their stomachs, to remain alive and to adapt to nature's opportunities, is what we would now call wages. We work for our daily needs, we fulfill them, but this branch of our very earliest ancestors said, well, no, hang on. We would like to create a new kind of sphere of existence. But how could that come into being without working a bit extra every day to generate an extra flow of energy that could be invested? Well, to try and create this new sphere within the universe, first of all, they had to invest this additional flow of what we would now call economic rent, this net income, this extra over and above what we need for our daily well-being, a flow of energy. Our primate ancestors invested it in their bodies, alter their posture, expand their brain. They obviously perceived the possibility of a new kind of universe, a new kind of life. But that all came out of this one organ that was energy hungry. Mm-hmm. They wanted to expand the brain in their bodies so that they could visualize a new way of life. Well, that required them to work for more than their bodily needs, their metabolic needs, their wages. That extra flow of energy, which they shared within the group, was what we would today call economic rent, or just rent. So it's not like what you pay for when you hire a car or an apartment, because when you're doing that, you're actually delivering what I define as rent and extra for the use of the product that you're seeking to borrow, a vehicle or an apartment. That's not what we mean by rent. The rent is just the net income, the extra over and above our daily family immediate needs. And it worked, because by working that extra bit, they were able to develop moral codes of conduct. They realized that in order to discipline behavior, to avoid cheating by any one individual, there had to be rules. So they invested in developing these moral sensibilities. And then they had aspirations come into this big brain of theirs, reaching for the stars. Well, how could you do that without funding the knowledge that was required? So bit by painful bit, over hundreds of thousands of years, they worked extra. Our nearest primate cousins, genetically speaking, are the chimpanzees and the great apes. Well, if they had the capacity to think about what these hominins were doing, they'd say, what fools you are. Why don't you come and sit back in the sun and enjoy yourself? Why are you working extra? They were working longer than they needed to in order to create this, what I call social galaxy, this extra sphere of existence within the universe that would open up their capacity to reach for the stars, which we are now doing. But it all hung on the willingness to work extra to create this flow of resources and to pool those resources for the common good, to make it possible for a rule-bearing species with the imagination to visualize a different future come into existence. So that's the nature of rent.
So if I was to put it another way, you want to have a realm of creativity, of dance, of music, understanding the world, philosophy. A curiosity builds up, and to be able to explore that curiosity and have social relationships and communities, you need to have a surplus to be able to pull together and kind of keep each other safe and help people in hard times. And to kind of accelerate that, you start using equipment, tools, what economic terminology we call capital to help you continue to do that. And you also needed access to nature. So those are the three things, what you describe as labor, which is your hands, your working day. You need access to natural resources, and then you also develop the ability to use tools and equipment. And those three things enable us to better expand and have a broader community. Is that a different way of putting it?
Yes. Yeah. None of that is possible without that additional revenue. You use the word surplus, which is what a lot of academics use instead of rent. But it's not a surplus. The people who go out into the fields and work to generate this additional revenue, and they're not doing out of recklessness, out of no point. There's an intention. It's not a surplus to their requirements. It's very much a part of what they need. So, yes, we separate it from the stream of income we call wages, the stream of income that we would allocate to create the tools we need to help us to increase our productivity, in order that we have this additional revenue which we intentionally create. It's not a surplus that's additional to what we need, that's up for grabs by anyone. So that's why I think that the words we use is so vitally important. We have to specify the social status of this stream of rental resources. Once those resources were privatized, now they became a transfer income. Now the people who collect that revenue, who are the cheats, don't give anything in return. They sit back at the campfire. They wait for the others to go off and do that labouring, bring back the resources, and then they just take their share of it. They're cheating. Well, the moral codes that were developed early on were designed to prevent the cheating. We're all in this project, the human project, to develop us out of nature. We've all got to pull our weight. We've got to pool for the common good a certain part of what we produce. And in that case, we can do all the lovely things that you referred to, learning to sing, learning to pray, learning to paint, amplifying our aesthetic sensibilities, all as a result of pooling the rent.
And I remember, being a school child playing sport, for example, or working in group projects, if you weren't pulling your weight, your classmates or your teammates would be, come on, Amel,
Exactly.
You should have done that tackle, or you're not rowing hard enough, whatever it is. So you had this sort of, the community, the size of the group was small enough to use the tool of shaming to kind of get people to not cheat or not free ride.
That's right.
And was that the main mechanism to prevent rent seeking or cheating?
That was the mechanism. It was a personal approach to disciplining behavior that existed up to the point of the beginnings of civilization. And it worked, and human beings emerged out of nature as Homo sapiens, capable of reaching for the stars one day. They had developed the capacity to begin to accumulate the knowledge. But once they started the civilization settlement arrangement, which began with the transition from foraging for food to farming to producing the food, which meant they had to settle down and distribute the land. That was when they was vulnerable to the cheats, because now the cheats weren't in their immediate circle where they could censure them for misbehaving. Now they pooled those net income, those additional resources, into the temple, or what became known as the palace, and they lost control over them, the direct personal control. And some of the people that they trusted to look after the welfare of their communities decided to cheat, and they got away with it.
So there was a pivotal moment, the movement between the Neolithic world to the post-agricultural revolution, creation of civilization, which basically set this motion in train of cheating and cycles of kind of rise and fall, collapse because of rent extraction. I can hear people, going, well, come on, Fred, this sounds a bit kind of Rousseauian, kind of noble savage. Like, actually, the Neolithic times were pretty brutal. It was only until the onset of civilization that we actually started to learn to not kill each other, not steal, not plunder. What do you say to that kind of traditional, classic, maybe conservative mindset of original sin, or the Hobbesian, we're in a state of nature, and until we have some strong centralized government that dictates things, we're all going to be at each other's throats in a state of nature? That's the kind of common, anti, let's say, radical liberalism perspective that maybe you're taking here.
Yeah, well, Hobbes wrote at a time before the accumulation of the knowledge that we now have. So he, yes, referred to the early phases, brutish and short. Well, there's a problem with that argument. There is no evidence when we look back in nature through anthropology and archaeology and so on, where we can observe a situation comparable to what we see in Gaza today. There was no brutish behavior of the sort that we are now capable of inflicting remorselessly, as Russia is doing with its drones over Ukraine. There's no equivalent back in the pagan times when people were pre-civilized, but they had codes of behavior that didn't allow the cheating that we allow. And it's the cheating that results in the kind of devastation that isn't observable either in nature or in that transitional phase out of nature up to the point of the origins of civilization 5 to 10,000 years ago.
And we like to kind of, as that kind of interested school kid or whatever it is, lionize antiquity and classical Rome or classical Greece. And you actually, when you grow up and you learn a bit more about it, and you think, actually, the way the Romans treated the Carthaginians and just genocided the entire civilization once they defeated them, or the way the Spartans treated their neighbors, the Helots, by emasculating them. Any Helot male that showed any sign of standing up for themselves or any kind of spark of energy or independence, they would castrate them so that they wouldn't reproduce, and therefore encourage the neighboring Helot city to be as passive as possible. And in the way the Egyptians as well similarly treated their own citizenry. So your argument is that we kind of, the problems we're facing today in 2026 are rooted in that transition thousands of years ago into civilization. Is that
5,000 years ago? We've betrayed the human project, which was built on an ethical behavior that required everybody to pull their weight. Simple as that. You can have what you want as long as you work for it. You can keep what you create, but that stream of revenue that we all cooperate to produce, we need to pool that for the social public services that we all want to share in common. What went wrong at the beginning of civilization was driven by the insatiable appetite for taking revenue that the people who were taking it didn't earn. So yes, when we look at classical times, we see the building of empires. What were those empires for, other than to extract the rents out of those populations? when people weren't available to work, what was the point of turning people into slaves other than to produce the rents that the rent seekers wanted? So when we correctly analyze our history, it really all does come back to this issue of who controls the rents. Are they for the common good, or are they for the exclusive privilege of a few people who want to build pyramids so that they will go to heaven, and to hell with the population that actually built the pyramids? Today, they don't build pyramids. They build £500 million yachts, which they anchor in the harbours along the south of France. Their insatiable appetites know no bounds. And so it's all about extracting this energy that makes humanity possible.
For the purpose of conspicuous consumption, which is the term you used.
That's right.
And so you mentioned a social galaxy, and which is the realm that we create as conscious, sentient, and sort of rational, if that's the right word, beings. You likened the social galaxy to having properties similar to Einstein's relativity theory. So as gravity grows, that an object with large amounts of gravity will affect space-time around it. And similarly, as rent or net income grows, it affects people's behavior around it. Was the temptation, whenever that net income became big enough and civilization began just too strong for us to not seek it and cheat, was there an inevitability about this paradigm that we're in of cheating?
Well, it was inevitable in the sense that at the time of the beginnings, when people were settling down, they didn't have the capacity, the organization power to control the way that their rents were used by the people that they trusted, the wise men, the holy men of their communities, who previously they trusted but also controlled. So the leaders couldn't get their way. They were answerable to the people. But once the community settled down and expanded, the knowledge for controlling the way this new decision-making system operated wasn't available to the people. They trusted their leaders, and their trust was betrayed. The leaders then set about creating the infrastructure of the state, which was the power nexus that enabled them to control the people. And what happened to that flow of additional revenue, so that they enshrined in the power structure their personal cheating behavior and excluded the people who worked.
Yeah, and it wasn't just manual labor. Slaves would be used for teaching, for education, as well as, so they're extracting your knowledge as well to enable noblemen to therefore go on and carry on conquest.
And so they employed professionals like lawyers and accountants, but they were subservient to the cheating culture. And we've inherited, that's the legacy that we've inherited from antiquity, through classical Athens and Rome, through the feudal era into modern times.
So there's all sorts of historians out, there's pages and pages written about the causes of declines of empire. So there's the sort of silk slipper analogy, where it's clogs on the way up, hard men breed, it's tough times breed hard men, which then breed good times, which then breed soft men that create decline. So there's the sort of clogs on the way up, silk slippers on the way down thesis. Then you've got the, geography or climate change, population, demographics, migration. There's all sorts of theories abound about why civilizations grow and then collapse. But actually, your argument is that at some point, you start with human ingenuity and pooling together of resources and a common good, and then at some point the cheating becomes so prevalent that it causes an inevitable collapse. And this has happened over and over again, whether it was Rome, Greece, Florentine, or the Renaissance, the Age of Empires, and now today. Is that right? Was that a fair way of putting it?
Yes.
Yeah.
The empires are built on accumulation and the use of force, but all the time the moral fabric of society is declining because the cheats are getting their way, and there comes a point where they can't defend what looks like a big empire, an impregnable empire, but the barbarians walk in with practically no weapons, just their desperation to find somewhere to live and work. Or in the 12th century BC, some mysterious people we now call the boat people, they sailed down the Mediterranean into antiquity, into Egypt and Mesopotamia, and they overran these vital, seemingly vibrant civilizations, but they were ready to collapse because the moral fiber had dissipated.
That Bronze Age collapse that you talk about feels weirdly similar to where we are today. You had that sort of perfect. It kind of worked until it didn't. So you had the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and they were all kind of actually traded a lot with each other. They had alliances where no one power was ever too supreme. But within each of those kingdoms, the temptation to cheat and rent seek and extract, particularly the priestly class in Egypt, for example, to have that conspicuous consumption get bigger and bigger, meant that when you had a change in climate, for example, there was a big volcanic eruption apparently in Santorini. There was harvest got worse and worse successively because of changing weather patterns. So you had this huge migration from the sea peoples or the boat peoples that you talk about, and these kingdoms just were not able to they were not robust enough. They were too fragile to be able to cope with that because they were no longer producing enough and keeping what they produced. There was too much cheating endemic in the system, and it kind of feels eerily similar to where we are today, where we've got a lot of changing weather behavior. What causes that, who knows? We've got a lot of migration happening, and we've got apparently very wealthy developed countries, but are seemingly kind of actually, you had a stat for the UK that there's more tax takers than they are taxpayers now for the first time in a long time. And so that cannot sustain itself. So winding forwards today, we do now have a better understanding and education about what causes things versus what the Neolithic peoples had back in the day, they were not well equipped to be able to kind of mentally argue against the culture of cheating. We can argue against it now. So are we better placed to save ourselves?
Well, yes and no. I remain optimistic for reasons I'll explain in a second. But right now, the people who are the leaders of the rich world refuse to talk about what is ultimately the existential reason for why seemingly powerful civilizations collapse. They will not use that word rent or the net income. They will use any kind of explanation, any description, except the one word that enables us to focus attention on the policies that would enable us to recover the situation, to start rebuilding from the inside the system, the strength, the vitality of society. So the descriptions are multiple about what's wrong with our system, except the one issue, the cheating, as I call it, is not discussed. in the language that enables a lawmaker to draft a law saying, well, we're just going to reform the tax system, the revenue system that we employ. No words that are allowed to upset the power structure. But the reason why I remain optimistic is, yes, we've had for this year, 2026, we celebrate the 250th year of Adam Smith's publication of The Wealth of Nations, where he first laid out the terms of ethical economics that were coordinated by balancing the private sector, the free markets, with responsible governance based on collecting the revenue from the rents. You can only have a free market, a truly free market, not the perverse system that we have today, if you have a responsible form of governance. And by merging the two, you have the power of the people acting responsibly as individuals and as social beings. The knowledge has been with us for 250 years. It's been suppressed every time. But if the people now become aware of the existential threat to themselves, their families, and their communities, they just might decide that now is the time for change. And the modern technology of communication means we can bypass the official media and the think tanks that pretend to be our intellectual communities and the people who are claiming to be our leaders, and we can communicate with each other on a global scale. And that leads me to believe that if somehow this message could be got out to the people, they can start to inform themselves. And once that happens, once there is a sufficient number of informed people, then the lawmakers will panic and they will have to start making the changes. But until then, nothing is going to change.
Well, let's spend some time on Adam Smith then. He's deeply misquoted or misunderstood by many people today. The invisible hand, or the baker doesn't care about. He's that quote about when people go to work, they're not doing it out of some altruistic generosity. They're doing it for selfish needs, which is true only if you contextualize that within a system where rent is social. Adam Smith wrote that because the premise that he based that on was the fact that rent would be socialized, and that your wages and your capital investments were for you. So he didn't mean that as a kind of free for all with everything. Can you talk about his inspiration, which is the physiocrats? Because there seems to be a big what if moment in history, particularly with revolutionary France. If the physiocrats had got their way, we may not have had the bloodshed of 1789 to today, because that revolution was so consequential to where we are now. Who were the physiocrats? How did they inspire Adam Smith? What were they arguing? And could they have got their way if possible? Well,
in a sense, that was the inflection point between a successful civilization and the one that we now have, where our leaders simply are obsolete because they don't know what they're doing. The physiocrats were just a group of philosophers in Paris in the mid-18th century who figured out that the sensible way to fund the public services was by directly collecting the agricultural rents, the farmland rents. If that had been done, it would have been at the expense of the feudal nobility, obviously, but who owned all the farmland. But it would have begun to transform the relationships between the peasants who worked and the nobility who claimed the rents that the peasants were producing. They elaborated a philosophy that made this case. Yes, it was a limited one in terms of the way they defined value. They were just before the dawn of industrialization, so they still thought of rent in terms of coming from the farmland only. But it was enough of an opening for Adam Smith, the moral philosopher up in Glasgow, to go to Paris, to study what they were saying, and then to begin to embroider that philosophy in the context of making pinheads in factories back in England and Scotland. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. He was not advocating or representing the worker as selfish. That is the way that we today deliberately mischaracterize what he was doing. As you've said, he portrayed the relationship between the working people and their social responsibilities on the basis that if the people who worked gave the rent to fund the services that they needed, that they wanted to share in common, then they were free to go about their business without thinking about anybody else, but to look after their own personal needs, because they were simultaneously also fulfilling their social obligations. Again, in France, the finance minister who wanted to change the financial system, a guy called Turgot, advocated it to the king and was promptly sacked, because this would have infringed on the power of the people who were collecting the rents, and it wasn't to be allowed. As a consequence, Turgot's fears that the peasants were becoming disturbed, exploited, disgruntled, did lead to what he forecast, which was a bloody revolution. That revolution was based not on understanding what needed to be done, but just construct the guillotine, chop the heads off the monarchy and the nobility, and nothing changed in terms of what happened to the rent, because it wasn't being analysed in the context of the onset of industrialization and rebasing decision-making in favour of the people who produce the wealth of the nation. So that model was replicated in Britain and the rest of the industrializing world, and then in America, and brings us to where we are today, which is people know there's something fundamentally wrong with their system. They call Britain, for instance, a failed state, but they don't actually identify why it's a failed state. They don't explain why our prime ministers keep getting the chop for failing to deliver what people need. All we have is a constant turnover of prime ministers who are simply helpless. They lack the power. We lack the vitality to protect our nation from the people who are now being driven out of Africa, crossing the Channel, landing on the beaches of Dover. We're repeating history all over again, and it's just because the system will not allow us to discuss the root cause of our problems.
And you say they don't have the power. I would say they also don't have the ideas or the understanding or the education establishment has withdrawn the knowledge that was would have been available to, let's take Winston Churchill, for example, or John Stuart Mill. There was a few other what-if moments in history. Winston Churchill did the budget in 1909, is that right? Which could have set in course the idea, reinstating classical liberalism and the ideas of Adam Smith through funding the state from rent. Can you talk about that? Because it feels like the leaders today just don't know about that. They don't have the knowledge. They don't understand classical economics. They're too brainwashed. Not brainwashed is the wrong word, but like they're too narrow in their education of economics and philosophy to understand the role of natural resources.
Yeah, well, brainwashing is not a bad way to describe it. It's willful blindness. There is no secret about the formula that would enable us to flourish as a society, a free and prosperous society, one that was responsible for dealing with nature and the other issues that are now accumulating as existential threats to our society. What happened late in the 19th century was that an American journalist called Henry George wrote a book which, because most people were tenants, people identified with. He said, look, the reasons for poverty is not that we're not working, it's just that we're not allowed to keep what we produce, because there are a bunch of people, the free riders, who are just taking the net income out of society, pooling it for their personal use instead of what was intended, which was for the common good. That book, Progress and Poverty, became a global bestseller, and it created the first global reform movement of people, which ultimately led to the British government introducing the proposal to reform the tax regime in 1909, 1910. They began to prepare the foundations for the transition to this system, but then we hit the barriers, World War I. People are decimated in the fields, chopped down by machine guns. Along comes 1920, 2 years of so-called peace. The Conservatives say, no, you're not to carry on with that kind of policy. In fact, you've got to pay back the rents that you've already collected to the people who you extracted it from. And Britain was back on course for behaving like a failed state, which it was. And the 1930s, another world war. So the shift to socialism and Marxist ideology, and the idea that we could have the solution in the workers taking over the world, and we're left with the Soviet Union, which then collapses. Marxism succeeds in China, which has now been modified to allow a certain element of the market economy, but still the Marxists are in control. And we've got not just a failed state in Europe, but the whole universal system, a global civilization, is failing the people.
So there's that fork in the road in the late 19th century, early 20th century, where progressives or people who wanted to remove unfairness in the system that was preventing people from flourishing could have gone one of two ways. They could have gone down the classical liberal route of socializing rents, but keeping a free market economy, letting Britain's or the West institutions flourish, but also collecting for the public purse and for people, what they didn't produce. Or you had the communism, effectively, and we chose one route and not the other because of world wars. And why did Marxism or radical communism succeed as the progressives' avenue of choice for removing unfairness in the world? Because it feels like it's the wrong road we chose to go down that way, which has therefore made people very suspicious today of people who come along and say, well, we can create heaven on earth if only we had the right tax policy.
Yeah. Well, for two reasons. Yes, there were those liberals like John Stuart Mill who accurately described the way the exploitative process worked. Some people grew rich in their sleep, he wrote. The rent seekers, the free riders, and they were wanting to educate the public along the lines proposed by Henry George. But along comes a man with a grudge against the capitalists, Karl Marx. He leaves Germany, comes to London, he sits in the British Museum, and what he's looking for is a model against the capitalists. So he frames the language, words like value and the working class, to fit a model that excluded the humanitarian aspects of what Henry George had written about, for instance, and what Adam Smith had intended. Yes, he had to address the issue of rent. He called it shitty rent. He didn't want to know about shitty rent.
Right.
It was all about profits that the capitalists were taking, and we had to now nationalize the enterprises to give the workers the control. And at first, as we saw in the late 19th century, we ended up in Britain with an enlightened government, a liberal government that was going to actually adopt the Adam Smith model. But the World War interfered, and the chaos of the 1930s depression, the frustrations of people who had now moved away from understanding the nature of rent, led at the beginning, during the First World War, Lenin goes to Russia. They overthrow the Tsar, who refused to adopt the model that Tolstoy had learnt from Henry George and paid the price by having his head cut off. He was shot, actually, and his family were shot. And that created the opening for Lenin to say, it's those horrible capitalists. We've got to take command of the economy. And so it was these elements that accumulated, and the rent-based doctrine of a free society, a free market, and responsible governance was pushed aside in favor of what became the Soviet communist command economy.
And the big problem with Marx, or the big blind spot he had, as we've already discussed, is that labour exploitation has been happening for thousands of years before capitalism was even a thing, before the commercial revolution took off. It's been a feature of our civilization since the beginning.
Yes, and he used his ideology to rebrand the early periods of human evolution as communism. But it wasn't communism. These people who were evolving out of nature, as I seek to describe in my book, they developed personal, individual characteristics that were not communal. They struggled to develop personalities that were private personalities, along with their social personalities, this composite of the private individual who had social responsibilities, and this complex personality, which we don't see in nature, was based on individuals empathizing with other people, which is why they developed moral codes and aesthetic sensibilities, so that they had this social personality that overlaid their private personality. Well, that didn't fit Marx's idea. He just wanted everything to be communism. And so he pushes antiquity, or pre-antiquity, aside as, well, that was a model that we can show we need to reproduce today in the form of the command economy.
Yeah. So pivoting to very different group of people to the Marxists. Before I came onto your work and the work of Henry George, I was very interested in the, let's call it the rational optimist movement, or people like Steven Pinker, Matt Ridley, who basically said since the Industrial Revolution or the Scientific Revolution, things have been actually getting better and better. If you look at healthcare, standards of living, technology, we're all much healthier, happier than we were 300 years ago, when there was a lot of feudalism and serfdom. And actually, we're on this, with technology getting better and better, we're on a course of kind of future prosperity. So let's all be rational and optimistic about the future and how lucky we are today. One thing I've slowly, that is a view that has its place, but I have been able to temper that through understanding economic rent a bit better and exploitation. And I was surprised to learn from your latest, your book, that actually fertility rates, marriage rates, our life expectancy is starting to go down now. And 200 years ago, for example, the life expectancy of someone in the northeast of England was 10 years lower than it is today. And that's still the case today. That, if you were born 300 miles north from London, you're going to live 10 years shorter. So this rational optimist movement has its limits.
Yeah. Why is it in a seemingly prosperous nation like the United Kingdom, there are groups of people who are programmed to die 10 years earlier than others who live in rich boroughs in London, for instance? There's something in the foundations of the system that's killing them off prematurely. There's no need for them to die, but they are dying. And that's been done under the supervision of a so-called rule-observing democratic form of governance. But while the statistics are accumulated, nobody actually gets to ask the awkward questions. They just talk about, we'll go and level up the north. But they don't know what they mean by levelling up. Yeah, shifting a bit more money up north, build a few more roads, extend the railway. Well, all that will do is end up amplifying the problems. An additional railway will further separate those who are the ones that are accumulating the capital gains and those who are excluded from them. There is no structural change to the system. Yes, it's true. We've doubled the living span of human beings over the last 200 years. Was that out of the goodness of the hearts of the people who are the rent seekers? No.
So moving away from Marxists to a different group of people, there's the crowd, the rational optimist crowd, people like Matt Ridley, Steven Pinker, who argue that since the scientific revolution, our living standards have basically gone up dramatically, life expectancy's gone up, health, mortality, it's all getting better. We just need to make sure we don't get in the way of science, technology, innovation, and capitalism, and we'll carry on moving into an age of abundance and prosperity. Now, there is something appealing and rational, perhaps, with a capital R about that. But having come across your work and the work of people like Henry George, it's been quite eye-opening to also see that there is some systemic unfairness against people actually being the best that they can be because of the way we organise our society. And that has become so prevalent that actually mortality rates are coming down in the developed world. Fertility rates are plummeting, marital rates are collapsing as well. And if you take one disparity that you talk about in your book, for instance, 200 years ago, there was about a 10-year life expectancy for males living, difference between males living in London versus males living in the northeast. So you would live 10 years longer if you were lucky enough to be born and live in London. wind forward to today, if that prosperity thesis played out, then that gap should have, merged. But it hasn't. It's still there, prevalent today, that if you were born in the Northeast today, you are going to live 10 years longer, less on average than you are in London. So why is it that despite all this prosperity, technology, innovation, science, we still haven't managed to kind of universalize that prosperity?
Well, there is a myth that the intellectual communities subscribe to, which is that, yes, all the technology, all the scientific things have produced wonderful advances, and yes, we've doubled our lives since the 18th century. We now live a lot longer, except for those who die prematurely, of course. They attribute this to the technological advances, but they say, oh, but technology also has a trap in it. This trap is, people are rendered obsolete. They lose their jobs because of the technological advances. And so that explains poverty.
Right.
Oh, okay. So is that all that happens with technology, that some people lose their jobs and are shoved into poverty? No. Who is the main beneficiary from the scientific advances over the last 200 years? Not the working people who keep slogging their guts out to make a bare living, some of them not even able to do that and relying on charity, having to go to food banks to get food to put on the table for their children. All the technological advances which reduce the costs of production also expands the net income, the rents that are available, which are not shared equally among the people who work to produce them. They are shoveled into tax havens, invested in luxury items, nothing to do with ordinary people's lives, which is the point that Adam Smith was making, that this is a totally unfair way of distributing the benefits of technological scientific advances. So yes, people live longer. That means they've got more years to produce the rents that are then hived off to the free riders in our community. And one consequence is that, as you pointed out, the life expectancy gap has not been reduced. And that's because of the fundamental reality in the foundations of our system, which is if you are deprived of your share of the net benefits of society, you end up in despair. And you pass that despair on to your children, who lose the appetite to aspire to better things. They're relegated, they're segregated into enclaves, and they don't get the benefits which people like me in the London borough where I live enjoy fully. So one indicator of that injustice administered by our democratic governments is a difference of 10 years in life expectancy. Where is the justice in that? Where is the equality before the law in that? It's a joke, this idea that we're all treated as equals.
Yeah.
We're not.
I came across, through your work and others, David Ricardo's law of economic rent, which is a really interesting theory, but I struggle to articulate it in conversation or explain it. You've written a book about that, which I can see from the corner of my eye, Ricardo's Law. Everyone's reasonably familiar with his comparative advantage thesis as to why free trade is important, but they're less familiar with his explanation of why economic rent is an important thing to know about. So could you just help us unpack that, if possible?
Yeah. People are rational. In the early ages of agriculture, they didn't go and try and grow food where the soil was infertile. They went to the best locations where they could concentrate their energies to maximize their output, which gave the largest net income, rents. That made sense. Why work on an infertile plot of land when there's a fertile plot of land waiting to be used to grow your food? And it's the same with industrialization. Manufacturers gravitated to the locations where they could optimize their economic activities. The process is called agglomeration, concentrating in those locations where you have the lowest costs and the maximum output, productivity. Well, that meant that those locations had the highest net incomes, rents. And as you move further away from those concentrations, the productivity declines, which means the rents decline. We see this in the profile of house prices. House prices in London and the southeast are the highest. They're lowest up in Scotland. And the logic is that we move about to achieve the most that we can deliver for the least effort. That makes human sense. But in doing so, we are increasing the amount that we produce collectively that's net of what we need as our wages. So if we look at the wage profile across the national space, when you exclude the amount that people pay for their housing, their wages, their take-home incomes are pretty standard right away across the economic space. It's what's left after you deduct the wages that is an indication of the net product of some areas compared with others. And so what Ricardo demonstrated was, of course, location matters. The more productive areas have the highest rents, and then they decline to the margin. Nobody goes beyond the margin because not only are there no rents beyond the margin, they're not even producing enough wages to look after their daily needs. So the margin is the end of the space that we occupy to produce what we need. Well, okay, but that doesn't mean that those living in the privileged, the most intensive productive areas are entitled to keep those rents, because everybody within that territorial catchment area, part of the economy, is helping to produce the net income. It's not the product of any one individual, but the whole group across the territorial space. So people in the northeast of England are contributing to the production of rent down in the southeast of England because they're buying the goods from produced in the southeast. They're investing any savings they've got in the banks located in the southeast, pushing up the location values as a result of their participation. So we are all entitled throughout the space to share in those benefits. But because we don't do that, because we reserve the net income for the privileged people, the free riding population, well, once that starts to happen, we don't want to be reminded of the poor people in our midst, so we segregate them. We're supposed to be a society where everybody is treated as equal before the law, and yet segregation happens in our society. We think it only happened once upon a time in South Africa. No, it's happening every day in our society, where we push the poor people, the low-income people who are deprived of their human opportunities, deprived of the right to achieve their aspirations. They're segregated into the districts where we can forget about them, where we do not share our net income on an equal basis. We just keep them quiet. And that's why we have the poor districts and the premature deaths, and why the rich areas in London and the southeast are flourishing, or supposedly flourishing, but it's more complicated than that.
So a mental experiment of that would be, let's say, a depressed area of London, somewhere like Hackney or East London, wherever it might be. Someone decides to open a museum there or start a university. There's some sort of philanthropic or mission-driven behaviour that this makes them, compels them to do something in that borough. All of a sudden, that museum does very well. People travel to it. Restaurants and cafes start opening around it. Yoga studios, whatever you want to say, and there's a temporary uplift in living standards, in earnings and prosperity, and then all of a sudden, or over time, the benefits of that start getting captured by the people who own the property in the area. They haven't done any of the work. They haven't started the museum or opened the cafe or decided to design a menu that is interesting for a restaurant. But those people who have done that over time start finding it's getting more and more expensive for them to carry on operating. And the people who were living there and working all of a sudden find it harder and harder for themselves to live there. An example I've had, I was speaking to someone who's a governor of a school in Surrey, and she says one of the big problems we have at the school is teachers tend to marry other teachers, and teachers only earn so much money, and they find that they just cannot live in Surrey on the salaries that they have, and so they have a much higher turnover of teaching staff today than they used to have 20, 30 years ago when rents weren't so high. And what you're finding with a lot of teachers now is they're just moving to Singapore because they just have a much better lifestyle than they do in the UK. So you're getting this hollowing out as a result of this benefits of capitalism, of science, of innovation, of risk-taking being captured by landowners.
Yeah. And that's the simple fact. And of course, there are a lot of ordinary, hard-working people who are in that category of rent claimants. They are homeowners, so they are capitalizing unearned income into the value of their properties. And so up till now, over the last 70 years, since World War II, I'm one of them, have become part of the class that has benefited from the general uplift in productivity, which was not shared equally. We are claiming the rents that everybody else is producing. So the new generation are desperate. They can't afford to acquire homes where they can start their families. So that creates despair. It means the demographic crisis is on us, the drop in fertility, and it's all part of the hemorrhaging of the vitality of the social system.
I've spoken to classical liberal economists operating today, people from the Institute of Economic Affairs, people from the Adam Smith Institute, and I've talked to them about this. Why don't you elevate a land value tax as to the top of your priority list? What is it about the way you're seeing the world that you speak to them, they're like, yeah, all for a land value tax, it'll help. Maybe we replace business rates and stamp duty with it. and then see where we go. But Amal, the real problem is not the fiscal situation, it's the fact that we've got a planning system that prevents supply of housing to grow. We don't build enough houses, we don't build anything. And if only house builders were unleashed to be able to build property, we would then be able to redress the supply-demand imbalance and therefore enable house prices to come down and enable young people to get on the ladder and enable us, them to start families and all the rest. And I kind of find that answer not that compelling, personally. But what do you say to the people who are supposedly free market economists today, who view land value taxes as a nice to have, but actually it's all about planning and regulations?
It's shallow thinking. It's true the planning system doesn't deliver enough housing at affordable prices. But the planning system was never designed to do that. Why have we got a planning system? Because before the planning system, the free market didn't deliver the houses people needed at affordable rates, and the housing that was delivered before the planning acts of the post-war era were introduced, the housing that was delivered was shoddy. Awful to live in, causing diseases through the damp in the air and so on. And so action had to be taken. Unfortunately, it wasn't the free market, free society solution. It was a quasi-socialist one.
Right.
Oh, let's try and get out of this rut by having a planning system. And now we treat the planning system as the cause of the problem rather than a device that avoided confronting the reality. And so economists and the other public commentators are just dealing with symptoms.
Yes.
The planning system was never going to solve our problems. It was a device to dodge the issues, a way of sidestepping reality.
And if you're a house builder, you don't want to flood the market with supply anyway, because you're going to crash your margins. You're incentivized to land hoard because you'll probably make more money from the value of the land you're owning going up rather than selling houses.
Which is why when they buy land, they put it in their banks and hang on to it for 5 years in order to let the price go up. Well, the planning system isn't telling them to keep the land unbuilt on for 5 years. They are choosing to do that for a very good reason, the accumulation of the net income or the capital gains that are the capitalized rents that are created by the surrounding amenities provided by the community.
So we've talked about this before, but I think it's worth going through it again, maybe with some more details. We're in a debt crisis. We're spending too much money to try and address the symptoms of poverty that we have. £400 billion of COVID stimulus that has been spent 2020 onwards. Where did that go? Who knows? How we're also overtaxed, everything from starting a business, your wages, your capital, is as high as it could be. So how do we fund the state, and how do we fund a welfare system if it isn't through taxing our wages and capital gains?
Well, we've reached the point of exhaustion. The only way that we can apparently fund what people need, those needs determined by an unfair system, the needs would be far fewer in a fairer society. But the only way to fund the system as it at present is to borrow the money, increase the national debt, placing the burden on future generations so that we can apparently provide for the welfare of the people who are deprived of what they're entitled to today. And the reason why we use the taxes that are a burden on people, the income taxes, the taxes on their consumption and on the profits they make from their value-adding enterprises, is that the revenue that would not be a burden on people, the rents, have been extracted out of the system. So what choice do governments have other than to use burdensome taxes, which then amplify the problems?
Yeah.
People are going to have enough to cope with under the cheating system, but overlaid on that burden is the unfair way in which their incomes are taxed. And so we're amplifying the stresses all the time, which is why children are suffering mental ill health, why young people are not able to start normal lives by getting married, starting a career, earning their incomes. All of these things are coming together in a system that just isn't going to work.
Yeah. So you advocate taxing the site value of where your property sits on, basically. So not the property itself. If you want to add a tennis court or a science lab or whatever it is, that the benefits of that are yours to keep. But just the value of the land that your property sits on, it should be taxed at, I don't know, 2%, 3% a year, something like that. And that value is already assessed by various bodies in the state. So it's not hard to calculate what your land values are, and that can fund the state. And you, over time, remove the deadweight taxes, the deadweight burden that's on the economy through things like the national minimum wage and income tax. Is that right?
Well, that's the way we used to put the case in the past. But I've realized that people don't like taxes. So if I advocate a land value tax, they immediately think this guy wants to tax my land, and they're not interested. They back away. And I've grown to realize that the language we use is self-defeating.
Right.
We shoot ourselves in the foot each time we say, we want to tax your capital gains effectively on your home. No, that's not what we want to do. All that we're saying is this: if you want these public services that you want to access in the locations where you want to live or work, you have to pay your fair share of the costs of supplying those services. You want to be able to employ more teachers or nurses? Well, yeah, but who's going to pay for them? You want them, you should be paying for them. We need to change the revenue system away from taxes, which people object to, and onto a system of personal responsibility. Well, you see, when we buy a house, what we're doing is making a complex calculation. I want a 3-bedroom semi-detached house in this locality. I want it in this locality because I want to access those schools for my kids, or the medical services for my wife when she becomes pregnant, or access to the parks or the local theatre. And I am willing to pay for more than the value of the house for access to those services. Well, fine. So one is behaving responsibly when calculating how much we can afford to contribute to the community for access to those services in the given location where we choose to live. But instead of giving that value, which we're willing to hand over to the community, what do we do with that value? Well, we hand it to the guy who's selling us the 3-bedroom house. But he's selling us a 3-bedroom house that's depreciating in value through time. He's entitled to the value of the house that was built by people's labour. He's entirely entitled to the value of the building. He's not entitled to the value of the local services that are provided by society. So what we have to do is explain to the homeowner who's trapped in the current system that we need to shift over time, carefully, so as not to create catastrophes, either personal or social, shift to a system whereby when we buy a house, we accept this dual responsibility. I will pay you for your building. It's standing on a plot of land, but the plot of land is of no importance. The building is plonked on that plot of land. What I'm going to then do is pay for my access to these public services, which are the rents that are generated by the hospital, the school, the park, the highways, the public transport system. But under the present system, I give that value to the homeowner, and then what happens next? The government comes knocking on my door and says, oh, well, you're not giving the rental value to the community to pay for the public services, so awfully sorry, but we're going to have to tax your wages now because we've got no choice. Oh boy, that's a burden, because I've not only paid the rents to this homeowner, but I'm now having to have this invasion of my earned income by government to pay for the public services. This is an insane, irrational system, a corrupted one, a cheating system, and we have to transition carefully out of it.
But this is what the Conservatives get wrong, or which is, we just need to cut taxes and cut spending, because when that happens, great, your tax on your wages comes down, but what ends up happening is the landowner then gets a bigger share of that tax cut effectively over time.
Exactly.
So that when you're buying that property, because of its access to the parks, the schools, the hospitals, the highways, you're paying lower taxes to the government on your wages, so the landowner captures that in the higher, charging you more rent or a higher property price if you want to move in. And so you're tackling the symptoms again and not the root cause of the unfairness. And the statistics that you lay out in your book are just so staggering. I work in the investment industry full time. Everyone is obsessing about the market capitalization of some of the biggest companies out there. Nvidia, $7 to $10 trillion of market cap. Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, whatever it might be, all 2, 3, 4 trillion. Magnificent Seven aggregating to sort of 30, 40 trillion, which is sort of the largest. These top 7, 10 companies have been the largest proportion of global equity markets in history. But none of that all pales into comparison compared to the size of the real estate market. So you lay out Savills, in 2020, the worldwide value of real estate was 330 trillion. That's multiples of global GDP. There lies the source of funding to pay off this debt burden that we've created for ourselves, and to diminish the deadweight burden that we're placing on workers and innovators and capitalists. And it's just opening people's eyes to that. But that there's some double counting in those numbers, sure, but the solution is just obvious if you just look at the magnitude of these numbers, that just because you're living in London, you're not entitled to sort of those prices of your property going up year on year on year on year.
And so that's why I call the book Cheating. Human beings do not like cheats, and they don't regard themselves as cheats when they buy a property and then start to accumulate the rents. And they're not cheats, actually. It's the system that entraps people into it. What choice do we have but to become cheats by buying a property at the lowest price, sitting in it and watching the value going up, which we are not actually working to generate. That value comes from somewhere else. We didn't produce it. that makes us a cheat. But we don't intend that, and we don't like it. We boo when we see a footballer cheating on the football field. He's cheating, ref, punish him. That's our normal human disposition. We empathize with people's needs. We want to behave responsibly, but the culture of cheating traps us into the system, into behaving badly.
And we're all in on it in some way or the other. And would you, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but would you say supposed benefits cheats, or people using the welfare system rather than working, the incentives are to remain on welfare because the delta or the differential between staying on welfare and going to work is not enough to justify the back-breaking labour to kind of replace your earnings that you would get from welfare. Are those recipients of welfare just trying to get in on it? And, in terms of there's a pool of rent they don't have access to, it's being kept. And so this is their way of accessing that pool of capital, or pool of rent, that has accumulated.
Well, if you live in a corrupt society and there's no way to turn it into a responsible society, what choice do you have? When we want to buy a home, we can't do it on an ethical economics basis. We have to comply with the law. And people who are rendered isolated, low income or low productivity workers, if they can see a way to not working, it's all part of the game. The people in London, the people with power, they're corrupt. So what's wrong with me being corrupt? And so that's how the vitality of a society crumbles from within. We weaken it because we destroy the moral fibre of society. And why should we behave ethically if the people in power are not behaving ethically? And so it all crumbles.
And it feels like because living standards and wages and productivity has stagnated for so long now, that we are triangulating, your cause of optimism, that we are triangulating on the problem, albeit tentatively, could have perverse manifestations. So people like Gary Stevenson, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with him, very articulate, radical economist, who's advocating for wealth taxes, saying identifying all the problems, but now saying the solution is for a big wealth tax. This is the temptation that maybe the Labour government is going to fall into as well, if it lurches leftwards, if that's the right terminology. That doesn't tackle the problem, as I see it, in terms of the unearned income that people earn from rent seeking. That wealth tax will just is more of a sledgehammer that will trample down on innovation and labour. Is that a right way of looking at it?
Yes. The rent seekers love the idea of a wealth tax because they know it's not practical. Almost no government actually uses a wealth tax. When they try to impose one, they end up removing it because people say, well, I'm wealthy, I'm going to take my wealth and go and live in a tax haven. So that's self-defeating. We know from historical examples that when you talk about a wealth tax, you are talking about penalising not only the people who don't earn their wealth, but penalising the people who do earn their wealth. Why treat them as equals? Why not discriminate in favour of those who actually add value to the nation and become rich and so are entitled to their wealth? Treat them separately from those who are getting rich by doing sod all. The wealth tax, like let's tax the rich, is language that you can't convert into a law that can administer a justice-based system. So, at the end of the 19th century in Germany, the Prussian landowners, known as the Junkers, they loved the idea that a wealth tax was going to be introduced because that would distract the system from their unearned wealth. And so they actually supported a wealth tax in Germany. The landowners support a wealth tax because it ain't going to work.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, government is distracted from what would work.
So they, the government comes in and goes, well, the value of your watch is that, and your furniture is this, and your paintings is so and so. So that aggregates to this, and it's sort of all very complex and convoluted, and they're missing the kind of the main source of wealth that's sitting underneath the building. Can we pivot to some positive examples in history that have, worked? So you ask the question in your book, what makes Denmark, Denmark, for example? There's Denmark, we talked about Taiwan when we last met, Hong Kong, Singapore. Some examples in history where this type of thinking has manifested in positive outcomes.
Yeah, there are cases where either out of necessity or because of enlightenment, a justice-based income sharing system has been introduced. So Denmark is the best example where a monarch liberated the peasants, the serfs, by doing away with landed nobility. That was in the 18th century. In the 19th century, they imposed a unique tax on the large manor houses, which were collecting rents. They expanded the educational system for adults so that by the time they were going to introduce the democratic process at the beginning of the 20th century, an educated population understood the basis of fair ways of raising revenue, and they learnt about the land value collection that Henry George proposed, and they enshrined it in legislation in the 1920s. So Denmark now is a classic case of a nation that claims to be very happy. They're right at the top of the UN happiness index, and the only explanation for that is that they have the social solidarity that flowed from getting rid of the cheating in their midst. And Taiwan, when the nationalists were driven off the mainland by Chairman Mao's Communist Army in the 1940s, they instituted land reform and tax reform, and Taiwan now is one of the richest populations on earth.
Yeah.
And that's what rankles with the Beijing Communist Party. Beijing doesn't want the island of Formosa, which we now call Taiwan, for the land. They've got an ideological grudge against these free market, creative people who are flourishing just off their coast. So it's an ideological battle, not a battle for Taiwan is an island that belongs to China. That's just a cover story.
Yeah.
And there are other examples.
Hong Kong and Singapore. Singapore's Prime Minister last year, I think, warned about global property prices becoming a real systemic issue. But Singapore itself was built on, there's no land speculation per se, is that right?
Yes. When Britain gave up Singapore as part of the British Empire, the first Prime Minister said, well, we need to invest in infrastructure, we need land, we will pay the landowners the agricultural value of their land, not the price that they would want to put on their land as if the infrastructure was already in place. In other words, the rents of the land were kept by the state to invest in the infrastructure that makes Singapore such a prosperous place today.
That sovereign wealth fund can then, reinvest in the country, which is what we should have done with the North Sea oil, and maybe we can do.
Exactly.
Were we to. So how do we, looking at today and the future, some people argue we're going into an age of abundance with artificial intelligence. Do you subscribe to that, or are you quite worried about the job displacement that may come from that and this new technology that could possibly be quite sinister?
You're talking about artificial intelligence. The digital age at the moment is programmed to be a disaster for humanity because we're investing everything about human beings in this metaverse that has no empathy, no human sensibilities of moral behavior and so on. So what is it that we're investing in these humanoids that will soon be exercising superintelligence and acting autonomously? It's autonomous intelligence, not artificial intelligence. We're investing what we are today into this alternative universe. And we're already seeing the consequences. The autonomous intelligence in drones is flying over Ukraine or over Iran and dropping explosives on human communities. Mothers are in their beds with their children are being having their apartments collapsed on them by the drones that are exercising their discretion on where to drop the explosives. That's the kind of world that we are creating because that's what we currently do. Putin set out to demolish a free nation, Ukraine, and he's now able to use the artificial intelligence to selectively bomb people where it hurts most. That's the world we're creating. And this universe, for reasons I won't go into today, is going to be pitched against human beings, and I fear that it will be the artificial or the autonomous world that is going to win.
As we wrap up, you'll probably remember I ask every guest the same closing question, which is what I call the long bet, where you have a 10-year view to make a prediction. 2 years ago when I had you on, you talked about the 18.6-year property cycle and how 2026, 2027 is going to see the peak of property prices, and we're going to enter a recession, possibly worse, possibly a depression. I won't ask you to do another 10-year prediction from 2026 to 2036, but just ask you to double check your prediction you made 2 years ago. Is that still on track? Are you still confident of what you said 2 years ago? Not that it brings you any joy, of the prediction you made on this show 2 years ago.
Yes, the property cycle, which is only a metaphor for the way the rents are distributed, is on track. We're reaching the peak of house prices now in 2026. We've already begun to see the downward slide of prices in London, particularly the high value prices, and the decline in construction of new dwellings. And so that cycle is now still operating, and I fear that as a consequence of the decline in economic activity, this will amplify all the conditions surrounding our societies, like the mass immigration of hungry people out of the global south, which will have existential consequences for all of us.
Existential consequences require the desire to reform, to be able to survive from them and recover. You quote a contemporary of Adam Smith in your book, Edward Gibbon, who in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire was describing the downward collapse of the Athenian Empire, or of Athens. And in it he concludes, just quoting from your book, which is quoting Gibbon, in the end, more than freedom, they wanted security. This is the Athenians. They wanted a comfortable life, and they lost it all. Security, comfort, and freedom. When the Athenians finally wanted not to give to society, but for society to give to them, when the freedom they wished for was most, well, the freedom they wished for most was freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free and was never free again. I hope that this isn't a repetition of that. I'm hoping that we, through work like this, Cheating, the Human Project and its Betrayal, that we are able to identify the problem and start unpacking the solutions that you bring about in this book, and that the fall of Athens isn't replicated. Thank you for all the work you've done to date, Fred, in educating people, including myself, and hopefully we can use your work to turn things around. And in 2036, we look back and see conversations like this as a pivotal moment. Do you have anything that you would like to say or close on other than what we've talked about?
No, other than to express an optimism that because of the desperate plight that we now all face, finally people will demand change on the basis of being informed by what would actually be effective.
Here's hoping. Thank you very much, Fred Harrison. See you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
This has been Meeting People. I've been your host, Amal Pandya. This is a podcast produced by Matt Cooper with music composed by Loverman.